My name is Cameron Collins. I'm a revenue operations strategist with RevPartners. I serve as community manager here at Sprocketeer as well, which we're the largest independent community for HubSpot admin. I've got my lovely co-host, Mr. Mark Lerner here, Director of Growth Marketing at DealHub, and we have our guest, Tobias, on today. Tobias, for those who are just tuning in, tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what gives you the bona fides to talk about building out a global HubSpot portal at scale and some of the topics that we'll be covering today.
Yeah, I started working with HubSpot back in 2013, fresh out of college. My first job in then the second partner agency in the Netherlands. I think they were maybe the fourth or fifth in Europe. HubSpot was tiny at that time. Just the owner of the agency that year, he went to Boston and he brought donuts for the entire HubSpot team, which right now would break the bank. But back then, you didn't even have to make a reservation at Dunkin' Donuts to get them all. So that was really fun. And I've been working with HubSpot since then at different agencies. Did an agency for myself for some time, moved to Sweden, officially from the Netherlands, but live now in Sweden. I'm now working at Zooma. And Zooma is, I would almost say, a weird HubSpot partner because we're not really servicing like there's a dog here in the background. I hope that is being filtered out. We're not really servicing like the average customer. So really, like, most of our clients are very large enterprises, which is a strange combo sometimes. I think, especially if you look back in HubSpot, yeah, if you have an IT consultancy or with 50 people, then you use HubSpot. Or if you are a startup or a scale up with 20 and hopefully 50 people next year, then you're using HubSpot. And then we are using HubSpot at these international Fortune 500 companies, which that was what I really wanted to do. Is I want the most complex HubSpot projects. That's the ones that I want to do, and size helps in complexity. Yeah.
I would
That's super.
definitely echo that. I know that oftentimes the question gets posed of HubSpot versus Salesforce, and many times it's brought up, oh, at some point I think we need to use Salesforce. And clearly you're working with large international companies. What would you say to the people that think, and maybe it's arbitrarily, but they think at some point they're going to need Salesforce?
I don't think there's a clear answer of you should always go for HubSpot or you should always go for Salesforce. I'm not going to be so black and white. It really depends. In some things, HubSpot combo is great as well. And that's, of course, something that we see a lot where you have like marketing and sales enablement working in HubSpot, and then the actual sales making the contracts, more of the towards the back office happening in Salesforce. And
And
that's fine too.
and I think that's an important message, which is simply the fact that there is like this notion of you graduate from HubSpot into Salesforce. My business is so large that HubSpot doesn't serve the needs. I don't think,
Yeah.
and tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's a black and white notion where, oh, enterprise companies, Fortune 500 companies, they're so big and so complex that they have to use Salesforce.
No, I don't think so. No. Yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
often heard from people, oh, we're too complex, like we can only use Salesforce. And I've never actually heard the argument as to what is this level of complexity and why that it's just like you can't use HubSpot. But I'm interested to know, I think we've all observed the size and complexity of companies that are using HubSpot has increased over the last few years, and I'm wondering if that's what
No.
you've seen.
So for me, I've been working with now in the past like 3 years at Zooma, and that's just what we do. So for me in my career, yeah, definitely. But if I look longer back, 13, 2014, 2015, yeah, it was a lot of like below 100. That definitely went up more towards the 500,000, 2,000 employee companies. And then there's the ones way beyond that.
Yeah.
Who are
So
also using HubSpot sometimes.
yeah, maybe we can jump into a little bit about what makes things complex with working with multinational large enterprises that you work with on HubSpot, what are the different areas of complexity and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, some is legal is one that gives a lot of complexity. What can you actually do with the people that or what can you actually do with your customers and with your prospects? So you have different regulations in the US, for example, in California and the rest. Canada has different regulations from the US. But within Europe, you would think everything is going under the GDPR, General Data Protection thing. But then there's individual data protection officers in all these countries that maybe have a slight different take on something. And one that's usually quite rigid is, for example, Germany. They are usually a little bit more rigid than, say, Netherlands or Sweden or Spain, and then you have again like Australia, New Zealand, who are sometimes more following like European, but not completely. So it's that makes it quite fun and complex. But that's like just legal and data. They have also just in the processes. For example, if I say in the Netherlands, you know what, let's keep a 7-day delay in our sequence. They're like, oh yeah, fine. If you say that in the US, they're like, what? No, absolutely not. Can we do it 4 hours? That's maybe a bit extreme, but so when you then want to surface from a global organization to, I don't know, 50 different markets, you have to keep some freedom for the local teams to allow to adapt. But you don't want to lose the win, or what do you say? You don't want to lose
The momentum.
the benefit of doing something on a global scale. Because you don't want everyone to reinvent the wheel.
You want the economies of scale that you would get from a global organization, but you still want the people on the ground that kind of understand their markets better to have the freedom to be able to do what they. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but then you also want to be able to compare markets. So if one market says, yeah, but we say we define an SQL as this, and the other market says, oh, but we define an SQL as that, your measure of comparison is gone. So it's like quite selective, like where do you want to give, or where should you give freedom, and where can you actually not really give freedom?
And does that complexity in terms of legalities get even more complex with particularly highly regulated industries? Like I know in the US, when it comes to anything medical related, we have obviously HIPAA, but then each individual state has their own legalities. I would imagine those are even more rigid in Europe. So are there specific industries that are even on top of the complexity of just generally being international, create extra levels of complexity?
So I'm sure there is, but because it's all business to business, what we are working or what I'm working with, it's not that noticeable. It might be more that the people in the organization are more sensitive about it. So for example, a medical tech company is working with, and they were very strict. They wanted a double opt-in on consent of processing the data and a double opt-in on consent of communicating. So that's 5 emails before someone receives a marketing email, which was a little extreme. That was how Global designed it, or wanted it to, or the headquarters. This was actually funny because the headquarters were in say country X. Everything has NDAs, so sorry for
we can speak in generalities.
Yeah. So in country X, and then we went to the local market in country X, and they were like, "Don't put this live for us, please don't. This is gonna kill our conversion," which was interesting. Like 2 people in the same building, but one being global organization, one being local organization, super misaligned, and then you have to sometimes be the bearer of bad news when like something has been like, oh.
Do you find that as being the admin and architect behind building out the CRM, there's a level or a high level of responsibility for you to know and or understand the legalities across countries, or is it pretty typical that you can focus on the building, knowing that, for example, HubSpot will gate areas where, okay, I don't have to worry about implementing a double opt-in, because if I don't, then like we're getting in trouble because of it, right? So in other words, how much do you have to go
Yeah.
ahead and learn about the law compared to HubSpot knows that if I'm running in country X, a double opt-in is required versus in this country where it isn't, and so certain things might be auto applied.
So of course, as like being a configuration guy, my disclaimer is always, this is not legal advice, and we should listen to your legal team. And what does your global legal team say? And then with that in the back pocket, we try to establish a global frame and then bring that to markets and implement it for the markets, and then have a discussion with them. Okay, this is the frame from global, and you have the freedom that we have discussed with global to decide if you want double or single opt-in, have this or do that. And then it's them again talking with their local legal. Hey, this is what we got from global. What do you want to do?
So
Yeah.
let's talk about applying that then to scale, because I could think of a lot of the people who might listen to this and maybe they aren't a global business. Maybe it's something they're looking into, or maybe you are a global business and you're running into some of the problems we're about to cover. But I know that oftentimes companies will want to be able to serve local markets very specifically. Obviously, then, like we just talked about, having that global framework. So I know you mentioned to us having an 80/20 rule for localization. How do you approach allowing and ensuring that a business can allow for localization, but without it then compromising the goals for the organization or the company as a whole?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things that are important that to at least keep in that 80% is you need to have the definitions the same across the globe. I think you can keep, for example, in a sales process, to make it super practical, keep the steps the exact same. Keep the definitions of when a deal can move to the next stage the exact same. But maybe in Poland, you want to do a credit check in step 3, where in Germany you want to do it in step 4, for example. So like you can make some nuances there. And for example, with lead gen efforts, that's a whole different thing, because then we're not really talking about so much the structure, but say the content or the ad copy. We give you ad copy, we give you images, we give you some calculators or ebooks or whatever, case studies. Try to just translate it, throw it through a good translation tool, reread it, and that should be good enough. But if you see, oh, here we're using a stat from the US market or a stat from the UK market, try to find the similar stat for your market and replace it. If you feel like the tone of voice is off after the translation for your market, okay, make that change. Yeah.
I think that's a really important thing for people to be thinking about, because I know I've worked with sales organizations where the leadership has occasionally looked at rolling out a sales plan. And for example, they wanted to have a level of control and consistency that they were measuring across the board. So they had the same email, call, outreach cadence. For example, the US market, the UK market, for Germany, like all across the globe. And what was really interesting being in sales at the time and going through that process was different markets can use the same techniques. And there were certain things that we noticed were different, which were outside the scope of just saying, oh, this is the skill of the rep. And so an example of that could be email opens, where
Mm.
certain markets simply responded better to emails and they open more emails and they engage with more emails compared to other ones. And so I think that something that oftentimes many organizations don't think about, if we reverse engineer that situation, is how do I give autonomy and localization to certain areas of the business where it's going to have the greatest impact, right? So maybe defining what a customer is for the customer lifecycle stages, right? Maybe that should be standardized. But then if we
Yeah.
look at, should we send 5 emails and then a phone call, or should we call 3 times in one day and then send an email, right? Depending on what market, if we're talking about sales tactics and outreach, that's going to differ drastically. So,
Yeah.
is there anything that you've seen or experienced that is a wild faux pas or a wild don't
What,
do this in certain
what did you say?
markets?
Faux pas? What does that mean?
Yeah, a faux pas.
Is that an
It's like a red
Americanism? I figured it
flag.
was French.
Oh, yeah, okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah.
FAX. Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry.
Have you
Yeah.
experienced, for example, oh, if you go and reach out to people in Germany and send out, and you cold call, right? And you cold call them 5 times in a row, like they're going to blacklist you and like you're never going to do business with them, right? That's just
Yeah.
not how they do business. So, what are some things that you've noticed are just best practices to do or to avoid in certain markets? And again, we could speak in generalities here, but
Yeah.
have you noticed any trends for things that do work or don't work?
Maybe one thing that's interesting is also in the internal processes, right?
Yeah.
Where, for example, if you would see someone's boss in, uh, say, India versus in the Netherlands, it's a very different effect. Or even between France and the Netherlands, it's a whole different effect. So if you, for example, want to follow up with a rep on, okay, why didn't you follow up with the leads that were assigned to you? See the manager, yeah, in a country where it's super flat structures, like for example, the Nordics, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, maybe people will think, oh, nice of them to also put my manager in the CC so that he knows why.
Yeah, in the US,
Where
yeah, reps would not
someone
be happy.
else in another country, it might be like panic attack because my manager is in the CC. So like you have to be aware of these local differences as well. Yeah, for example, in the US, I think US and UK, I think is similar in that way where
The US people,
you probably don't want to do that
yeah.
unless it's like high escalation, but not for SLA says a follow up within 2 hours. It's been 2.5 hours. Then you probably don't want to do that yet. But yeah, other ones, of course, are bot lists, emailing a bot list in Europe. Yeah, that could give you huge fines. Where in the US, I think that's fine.
It's a gray area.
It's a gray area. Okay.
I'm not even
Okay.
sure.
It's definitely not best practice, but
I think it's the kind of thing that's really not enforceable. So there may be rules, but I'm sure there's someone out in the audience right now that's feverishly typing something correct. Yeah,
Not
I think
legal advice.
yeah, this is over, and we'll just put it on the screen. I think with things like Zoom
take care.
Info and those kind of tools, buying lists is probably less and less of a thing. I guess it depends on the industry. Yeah.
Yeah.
When it comes to dealing with complex, large organizations that have multinational locations, where do you make a decision about keeping a single port, creating individual portals for the different business units? What's your like decision matrix for something like that?
So I've seen both and I've worked with both. My preference is my personal preference is multiple portals. One that's not necessarily the best in every situation. The reason why I like one portal for each market is because because the business units add-on has not really had much of a roadmap, it feels like. I just quickly before checked how many updates have there been in the past year for the business units add-on, and I think it's been one. Like you can now associate workflows to business units. So I have a bit of a trauma of working with business units when they were just released. So I don't dare to fully recommend that to any customers right now. And then this again maybe goes back to like legal stuff and consent. Can data be shared between the different legal entities, right? There's a person that gives consent on, say, the global website. Can they be shared to? Can their information be shared with a local sales team in Brazil, or have they not given that consent?
Yeah, those are challenges that I think that a lot of people, at least I'm speaking about myself, it doesn't even pop into my head. That's a really complex problem. I would imagine that particular part of the journey, top of the funnel, where a lead comes in, is the most critical piece, right? Because if it, like you mentioned, if they click something on a the global site, and it does, how do you deal with that kind of that top of the
Slowly.
funnel?
No, sorry for the interruption. Go.
Very
No,
slowly.
it's okay. That was the question. It was like, is the top of the funnel kind of the big issue in terms of dealing with data? And is it something that you focus on, or is it mostly the back end stuff?
So I think I'm mostly focusing on up until the point of handoff to sales.
Yeah.
That's still top of the funnel.
Yeah.
So for example, then the situation can be if they haven't given consent in the beginning, but then they show more and more interest, and then we can say, okay, now this person has legitimate interest, so we can send them to a sales rep, contacts them, and say, hey, I think you would be better serviced by someone local in your market. Is it okay if I share your details? And then it's, yeah, sure. And then you hand it over. You have to make sure that it's logged somewhere, that it's okay, and then the data has to flow correctly, and that. But yeah,
Here's something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because I know you've worked with all different kinds of companies at different scales over the course of your career.
Mhm.
And I always think it's interesting when someone wants to roll out something that I would perceive as relatively simple. Like we have two different sales motions, two different sales teams, and two different target markets. And something like that, I would say, is relatively simple to implement in HubSpot compared to a multinational global company where everything is amplified. So the question is there anything that can be made more simple or streamlined in rolling out something for a large organization that's global? Or is everything going to be amplified, made more complex, whether we're talking life cycle stages, sales stages, pipelines? Everything is amplified, or is there anything that really fundamentally it's staying the same?
two different ways to answer this, I think. Because on the one hand, the nice thing with a global organization is that you can also learn and experiment in like all the markets at the same time. So you can like you can do 20 or 40 times more experiments. And then if something is successful in one market, cool, let's turn it into a pilot into 3 completely different markets, see if it still holds up, cool, let's incorporate in like the global strategy, and then make that best practice for every market. So that's to go from experiment to best practice takes a little bit longer because you want to test, does this make sense on a global scale? I think one thing that like what you're delivering from like a global organization to local markets, it's a difficult balance because some things you want to keep as simple as possible because you want to give the markets as much freedom to adapt it, right? To adapt it, I'm not saying that correctly. Give as much freedom to adapt it. Yeah, not really, because you don't want to ruin that skill benefit, right? You don't want them to have to reinvent the wheel. Getting stuck here in my answer, or
Well,
lost
so
my train of thought.
yeah, here's something that I think this really parlays into and is related to, which is looking at a business that's global, where we're talking about different countries, different cultures. And I'm wondering if and how this applies to a business that's testing different markets within the same country. So if we use the United States, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if I'm reaching out and doing sales, is the same outreach cadence going to apply in Michigan as it does to California, as it does to Florida? And
Mm-hmm.
I think the answer is it depends and it can. But I
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
just like when we're talking about international, where you have different cultures, it can apply, but also it might not. So
Yeah.
all of that is to say there wouldn't be a single answer, a yes, no, black and white. It always works or it always doesn't. But I
Yeah.
think it's important for a business to keep in mind that when you're going after different markets, like if you have two different territory managers, for example, and you're giving them the same exact tools and resources, they may not get the same results. And it's not just due to their skill level.
Yeah.
Even within one country, you can have different amalgamations of cultures and such, or market conditions that can impact one territory over another.
Yeah. No, and with I can give you an example. Working on an analysis for a company with how effective are the different markets in lead gen, and we have to find a factor to normalize it to. How do we normalize your organic search, or do we do it to normalize it to GDP? Or so what we've been doing now is, like, in an analysis like that, we normalize it to the amount of internet users in the country, so that we actually get normalized numbers to make a comparison between different geographical markets. So not just, yeah, for example, the Netherlands might have a lot lower number of internet users, but a higher percentage of internet users than South Africa or Kenya.
So this brings me to something that actually I've been wondering, where I'm a big fundamentalist guy, right? Like I
Mm,
get companies of all different size and scale, and they always want to do something complex, whether that's figuring out market saturation or the age old question, how do we make more revenue, whatever the case may be. And oftentimes the answer usually starts with, let's figure out life cycle stages. Oh, you don't have an MQL defined. Let's make sure you have a consistent definition for that. Very
yeah,
basic things. And
yeah,
when we're talking about international companies, I think a theme for this episode is that is amplified. And so it's really important that for any business, any admin that's listening, regardless of the size and scale of your business, you've got to have the fundamentals written down and
yeah,
agreed upon.
yeah.
Do you, when you're coming in and working with a large company, do you have common things you tend to look at, or common things that tend to be broken, that whether it's life cycle stages, sales pipelines, do you have any common things that oftentimes this is where I'm going to start? Or how do you go about
Yeah.
figuring out forensically, this is how I help them achieve their end goal?
I usually start with the sales process, figuring out what does your sales process look like? How do you define someone who is somewhere in the sales process? So then you automatically get to life cycle stages as well. That can be a fun discussion already. Like, what is a customer? If someone has been invoiced for the last time 12 months ago, are they still life cycle stage customer, or are they not? Then you get to the part of, like, okay, where are your sales opportunities coming from? And then it's, once I have that information, and usually it's giving them best practices, and then coming to a standard that we can then start educating the markets on. So that's all done, like, on a global level, and then it's more like education towards the markets of how it's defined, and this is the new global strategy.
You get a lot of pushback?
That depends on how you deliver it. Definitely. A way of eliminating pushback, I think, is, or minimizing pushback, is to not force it. Of, this is the new standard, now go do this, and if you don't do this, bad market. They'd be like, hey, we came up with this from the headquarters. Would you like to join in? And then show results. Once the results show, they want that to become their way of working. So that's not possible in every situation, of course, where you can run like two things separately or two things side by side. But if you have that possibility, that definitely helps with pushback or limiting pushback.
Yeah, and I think that I'm really curious to get your take on this, but it's important that those who are listening and watching this show understand that being a HubSpot admin isn't at this scale being an order taker. And Tobias, let me know if you feel differently, but this is a role that involves being able to make strategic decisions at a high level for a business. And it's not just, I think that we should create a new form or I think that we should just make a new workflow, but it's actually being able to think strategically about how do we grow every aspect and every facet of the business. And I'm curious to know, A, if you'd agree with that, but B, how you've gone about or how you might suggest listeners go about going beyond just the technical capabilities in HubSpot and actually learning and experiencing the strategic side of the conversation.
Yeah. So that is on this, how should I say, when working with these sort of companies, it's if I compare like what I'm doing in a day now versus what I'm doing in a day like 6 years ago, it's a lot more conversations and alignment calls and meetings and making sure there's all the, they speak in Dharmesh's terms, that all the vectors are aligned. And it's, you just be like, oh, cool, let's integrate with this tool now. Or, hey, we're changing all of this. Even like we're going to a different email template layout. Can be a couple of weeks of conversations, tests, A/B tests, and they have the rollout. And then sometimes feels, well, the speed of global change is, of course, slower than change in the markets. And that's what I think that's what is really important, that you don't limit the markets in their speed of their experiments, even though you do have to, big wheels turn slowly. You do have to eventually get every market on that best practice that one market has found. So yeah, it's a lot more talking. It's a lot less clicking.
And Mark, I know that you work with and communicate with executives of all different kinds of companies in all different kinds of ways. And so I'm really curious to hear from your perspective, just obviously as you've moved through your career, how do you think that people can, if they're stuck in this, I'm an admin role or mindset, like how do you get beyond that?
Well, over the years, I've interviewed and spoke with and interacted with people in RevOps, up just thousands. And this has always been their biggest challenge, and it still is today. I think because of the fact that the nature of role, there are still people, though I think it's changing, that view it as a glorified admin, basically, of a CRM, therefore basically just create this field for me, rather than the strategic partner that it has to be. And I think that there is no, it's everybody's favorite answer. It depends. There's no silver bullet here. I think all of us, regardless of our roles, need to learn how to advocate for ourselves, have confidence in our convictions. And I think that in terms of being in RevOps, your value proposition today is more clear than it's ever been, right? Your RevOps' role is to not only take orders, but to give insight and be a partner in the decision-making process. Some of the most scaling successful companies are ones in which RevOps is empowered. And a lot of the companies that we've seen crash and burn are the opposite. And I think if you need a proof point there, you can that's a great way to center the conversation. And I would say strategically, it makes sense if you want to be a strategic partner to come into the conversation with a strategic suggestion. about what you would do and why you would do it and what the potential outcome would be. I've always found that if you have all the answers, you not just be like, hey, I think it would be a good idea if we did this, but said, here, if we did this, it would look like this. These organizations would benefit, and I think that our final result would be this. It's much more likely that you're going to get buy-in to actually become that partner. That's my 2 cents.
I think that's a valuable 2 cents. I really do. And something that I've learned in my journey through my career when it comes to elevating your career, as you move up, the stakes get higher. And if you aren't comfortable with that, like there's nothing wrong with being a HubSpot admin. I want to be very clear about that. If you enjoy the architect side of it and you like building things, being a HubSpot admin is a wonderful thing. And you can have a wonderful career. You can make a lot of money, or at least a healthy living, being a HubSpot admin. Revenue operations is something that goes with being a HubSpot admin, but it is separate. It's a separate skill set. It's the strategic component of what many HubSpot admin do. But if you don't feel comfortable with the responsibility of sitting down with executives and saying, this is change that needs to be made and this is why, then maybe revenue operations isn't something you're comfortable with. That's okay. But as you move up, the stakes get higher. As the organization gets larger, the stakes get higher. And so, Tobias, to bring this back to you and to our conversation as a whole, one thing that I would really love to get your insight on is you're coming into Fortune 500 companies, you're doing HubSpot admin work, you're positioning yourself as a revenue operations professional, as someone who can help grow and scale the business. What are some things that you do or some best practices that you can suggest to really start the engagement right and make sure that you are viewed as an expert and you are viewed as a strategic partner rather than just an order taker or a HubSpot admin?
Yeah, that I think that is asking the right questions, asking a lot of questions and asking the right questions, not being afraid to ask questions. And to if a customer explains what the sales process is, yeah, but why? Does, like, if you think like it could be more efficient, it could be more streamlined, ask them about it, and not be like, oh no, this is dumb, you should skip that step, but more, can you explain why do you have that step in there? Is that beneficial for the customer? Is that helping the reps, or is that? So I think asking questions and also giving in the sort of suggestions that you give, I think, no, yeah. So in the sort of questions that you ask and in the sort of suggestions that you give, I think that is where you change yourself from an order taker. Oh, you want a workflow that does this? Okay, I'll go build that, to like an actual, a more helpful, strategic partner to the customer. And I think that's where you want to be. Because then
I
you
think
also
that
know that small benefit of that is that you will not get asked to build things that aren't possible, because in your suggestions you can already keep that in the back of your head.
I think that's a really, really good piece of advice. And if I look at some of my peers where I've heard feedback of how can they do better, or even how can I do better when I've had feedback. And oftentimes the feedback from executives has come in the form of so and so seems intelligent, whether it's myself or somebody else. So and so seems intelligent, but they don't seem to be asking the right questions. And executives know a lot about the business. I will maintain the fact that, in my opinion, if you are a revenue operations professional and you are wanting to be a bridge between a multitude of executives, you need to know the business and the architecture of the CRM to facilitate the business better than anybody else at that organization, better than the CEO, better than the CRO, better than the sales reps who know how to break it and make it do what they want. If you're in revenue operations, you better know your stuff. And again, there's a lot of pressure that goes with that. There's a lot of expectation that goes with that. But being able to ask the right questions, it's a sign of from the executives looking at us, right? It's a sign of I'm talking to somebody that has a roadmap in their mind of where they're going. And maybe they're asking me about things I hadn't thought before, or you ask a question of an executive and they don't know the answer. It's a wonderful thing, because now maybe you're thinking about things that they weren't, for whatever reason that may be. And so I think that's a really important notion of being comfortable with not knowing everything and understanding that not knowing the right things, it's a sign that you're on the right path. Now the question becomes, how do I know what questions to ask? And I think that's where just experience and time and enough usage of the CRM starts to come into play, because obviously you have to know what a sales pipeline is, how it works, what are general best practices in sales, what have you seen work. If you don't know like any of that, then how are you going to be able to help a sales team grow if you don't know anything about sales?
Yeah, good point. Like you have to be a practitioner as well,
Yes.
or at least no, you actually have to be a practitioner as well.
Yep.
Like if you are telling people to use HubSpot for when you're calling out to people, but you yourself aren't doing that, you have to live it through. So even like me, like I don't necessarily, if I have to call a customer, I can just grab my phone and call him. But I want to be a practitioner as well. So I also want to in the dirt. No, I'm gonna call via HubSpot, then I'm gonna make my notes in HubSpot, then I'm gonna set my document via HubSpot Documents, and I'm gonna schedule a meeting via the meeting link. I also want to have the actual day-to-day of a sales rep and the actual day-to-day of a marketeer that is using HubSpot, so that I can relate to what I'm actually saying, and not just designing something fancy in Miro.
I am a firm believer that you cannot be in this ecosystem and excel in it. Like you cannot fake it if you don't love what you. I think there are many jobs out there, many roles out there where you can get by being in this unhappy state. But I think that if you look at somebody who is a HubSpot admin or a revenue operations professional, then like you really have to love it, because I will be the first to say, I don't know everything about HubSpot. Certainly wish I did, but the same out of the box software that effectively operates the same for every single business, I learn new things every single day and every single week. And it's just because really you can do anything. And so then the questions become, how do we get it to do what we want it to do? And so, again, I'll admit I don't know everything, but I know a lot, and I know I'm always learning more. And the only reason I'm interested to learn more is because I love what I do. And Tobias, I think you probably fit that
I'm fully
as well.
agreeing. Yeah. Amen.
Tobias, thank you so much for coming on board with us today. I will open the floor if you have any last minute pieces of advice or suggestions for those who are watching, maybe an organization that wants to grow from a smaller market into a multinational one, or an admin that's looking to grow their expertise. But just open the floor for any feedback, whatever that may be, to our audience.
Listen to this podcast. Find
It's good
peers
advice.
to connect with. Especially if you're the only HubSpot admin in your organization, just connect to a couple of other people via LinkedIn or via the Sprocketeer community, and like plan a weekly hour where you just fire ideas off of each other. That has been like, for me, that has been the reason why I moved to a different agency or a different company, because it didn't have that anymore. And it has been the most fun sessions. If I didn't have it within the organization, then it has been the most fun sessions outside of the organization, just with other people who geek out over this sort of stuff, and that you can bounce ideas off freely. Get 3 or 4 people together and like hour every week, and like that, so helpful.
I think that's awesome advice. If you consider yourself a data nerd, a data purist, a HubSpot architect, a forensic architect, or anything of that nature, then this message is for you. Connect with your peers. Pretty much everyone that I've ever spoken to or met in the HubSpot community, really friendly, always willing to share their advice. that goes without saying that if you're not already in Sprocketeer, check out the show notes. We have the link to join our Slack group. We've got well over 1,000 members now. Every single day, there's new conversations happening on all different kinds of things. So whether you have a very specific technical question or you're just looking to connect with some peers and maybe talk shop about HubSpot, Sprocketeer is a really wonderful group that I would encourage you to join. I also can encourage, if you are a HubSpot admin, to be joining the HubSpot admin user groups or the Hugs, which are hosted by Deanna Gloff and Kyle Jepson. Those are run Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. You can always view recordings afterward if you can't actually join live, but the link to that's in the show notes. And then finally, if you've listened to this full episode, then we thank you so much for joining us today. You can check out previous episodes on Sprocket Pod on our YouTube channel and or on Spotify. We are on both. And of course, connect with Tobias, Mark, and I on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. Sprocket on and keep doing it big. Bye.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye bye.